speaking today as part of the Caucus and as part of the policy team here at UNEP WCMC, which is the United Nations Environment Programme's Global Center of Excellence on Biodiversity. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about item 4, where the CBD parties are taking some actions, inviting work and welcoming work from the IPBES. So let's start with what is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. First, there's a couple of things that it isn't. IPBES is not inside the CBD, and it isn't like the CBD. It doesn't create policies or agreements. And IPBES is not a subsidiary body of CBD, whereas SBSTTA is. So SBSTTA is going to directly advise the CBD on policy, but IPBES provides an evidence base that informs those policies. So IPBES is an independent platform. It helps to link science and policy, and it provides advice on conservation, on sustainable use of biodiversity for long-term human well-being and sustainable development. And IPBES provides that advice by conducting global, regional, and thematic assessments. And to do those assessments, they use a range of evidence. They use a lot of scientific literature. They also bring in indigenous, traditional, and local knowledges, and they can even use gray literature. They look for the best evidence that we have. And in these assessments, IPBES is aiming to be policy relevant, but it doesn't prescribe policy. So it leaves the decisions on which actions to take, it leaves those up to policymakers. IPBES assessments are evidence-based, and they help to inform decisions and negotiations under the CBD and other environmental frameworks. So policymakers look to IPBES to see what the best evidence out there is. Within the CBD, the parties negotiate what they ask IPBES to consider assessing, but IPBES decides its own work in its own plenary process. The IPBES plenary is a group of 147 member states. They meet one time per year. They decide which assessments to create, and then once the assessments are prepared, the parties review and negotiate the summaries for policymakers. There are a range of ways to get involved in IPBES. Experts can apply to participate as contributors to assessments, and that is done through the national focal point for IPBES or through observer organizations to IPBES. So that structure is a little bit similar to what we have under CBD. IPBES also provides avenues for expert training. They have fellowships. They have a whole work plan on capacity building. Again, what I want you to hear today is that you can get yourself involved in IPBES processes, but also that we as a CBD Women's Caucus can play an important role by connecting with national IPBES focal points, with expert contributors to share knowledge, even if it is gray literature, to share knowledge to help inform future assessments. And our input, your input, helps to ensure that the evidence base reflects women's knowledge, women's roles and impacts, and that strengthens the relevance of IPBES outputs for gender-responsive biodiversity policy. At SBSTTA, CBD parties are going to be considering how to respond to two of the latest IPBES assessments. They'll be looking at the Nexus assessment, which is a recent report that looks at how biodiversity change is connected, linked with changes in water and food security, human health, and climate change, and how actions towards biodiversity or these other issues are also linked. We'll also be looking at the Transformative Change Assessment Summary. This one explores the root causes of biodiversity loss and pathways to system-wide change in our action. Speaking very, very broadly, the draft decision that you'll see for item 4 invites parties to welcome these two assessments, to take some actions in response to the Nexus assessment and to the Transformative Change. It invites parties to welcome the approval of plans for a second global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services that will be done by IPBES, and it encourages parties to engage in the preparation of that assessment. The draft decision also invites IPBES to help communicate its findings so that CBD parties can use them. So the big picture in all this, I think we can welcome a lot of this work. We have broad support for IPBES findings. We can, as a Women's Caucus, I think we can welcome the continued work of the IPBES platform and the efforts that have been made to bring together a strong and very diverse knowledge base for decision making. And in particular, the specific recognition in these assessments of the need for equitable and inclusive approaches to biodiversity management. And that's grounded in the evidence collected. But I will note that gender is not specified or singled out. These assessments, even though they use terms around equity and inclusion, there's little specific evidence about gender and women, despite the clear relevance of women's roles, knowledge, and vulnerabilities in biodiversity-related systems and management. So we see that there is a continued need for documentation and evidence, and a need to use the evidence that does exist and is already available. So right now, the draft decision has no mention of gender equality, women's contributions, or gender-responsive implementation. It doesn't make a specific recognition that the IPBES summaries are largely gender blind, in that they don't reflect or state specific evidence on women's roles, knowledge systems, or differentiated impacts. The draft decision does do different things with the two assessments, and only one of them, the points welcoming the Nexus assessment, specifically asks parties to engage with stakeholders, including women. So that's positive. We might want to consider whether that's needed for others. We might want to push for the inclusion of gender-specific research and information to be included and made visible in the second global assessment. And we may ask for some specific party responses to the two thematic assessments. The point I really want to make here is that if IPBES assessments don't include gender analysis, there's a risk that policymakers might think that there's no evidence base for gender-responsive biodiversity policy. And we can, through the CBD process, we can try to correct this by specifically requesting gender-responsive actions and analysis. Thinking about what's missing on gender and what could be added, I think that we as a caucus can consider how we want evidence about women and their contributions, roles, needs, and rights in biodiversity to be addressed in that second IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And we should consider how we can use the CBD, SBSTA, and its processes and the connections that we can make while we're at the meetings to strengthen this. We know that nature's contributions to people are understood, they're valued, and they're managed to different extents. And women's reliance on biodiversity is less well represented in the body of evidence and the resulting management action. So we think that the global assessment could be strengthened by consideration of women's perspectives and knowledge, acknowledging those differences in values by different people. I also think it's helpful for us as a caucus to consider how we want the review of implementation of the CBD's Gender Plan of Action to be represented in assessments of progress. Now, there's a global review of progress that's happening under the CBD. There's also this separate assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services that's happening under IPBES. IPBES is not the review mechanism for the Gender Plan of Action, but for both of these assessments, we're going to need to help to ensure that evidence is provided, where possible, provided directly into national reports, but also made available to experts, to MEA secretariats for their own contribution and the contribution of other organizations and non-state actors. Thinking about IPBES, a useful way to bring in the Gender Plan of Action could be through sharing concrete examples of how implementation of this plan of action at national and regional levels contributes to transformative change, contributes to changes in policy or greater effectiveness of biodiversity action. So as we see from what happened with the Nexus assessment and the Transformative Change assessment, unless there is a specific request for inclusion of women and the subject of gender, we risk women's information needs and contributions being left out of the analysis and out of the resulting information that's presented to decision makers. The IPBES Second Global Assessment Scoping Report has already been agreed. And if you glance at that, you'll see that it has the word women one time, saying that the assessment will synthesize the findings of previous assessments relating to different roles of actors, including women. And it only has the word gender one time when it says that it's going to consider the distribution of nature's contributions to people by gender. So there is a risk that it will be a bit gender blind, again, like previous assessment. And I see Substat as a chance for us to connect with CBD parties, to shine a light on the existing evidence that we have, to share what we have, to advocate for further consideration and call for that explicit recognition of gendered roles and contributions, impacts, and perspectives relating to biodiversity.